On a California freeway in the spring of 1972, a Ford Pinto stalled. The car behind it struck it from the rear at roughly 30 miles per hour. The Pinto's fuel tank split open, petrol soaked the cabin, the car caught fire. The driver, a 52-year-old woman named Lilly Gray, died of her burns. Her passenger, a 13-year-old boy named Richard Grimshaw, survived, but not before the fire took most of his face, most of his hands, and years of his life that no settlement could return. What made this a scandal was not the crash. What made this a scandal was what Ford already knew when that car left the factory. This is the story of the Ford Pinto, and the memo that proved a corporation had done the arithmetic on human lives, checked the math twice, and decided that letting people burn was the cheaper option. The conventional reading frames the Pinto as a tragedy of engineering, a design flaw, an unlucky placement of a fuel tank that nobody quite anticipated, a cautionary tale about the limits of 1970s technology. That reading is wrong. The Pinto's fuel tank did not fail because nobody understood the danger. It failed in exactly the way Ford's own engineers had predicted, in exactly the crashes Ford's own tests had simulated, at exactly the speeds Ford's own documents had flagged as lethal before a single car was sold. What happened to Lilly Gray and Richard Grimshaw was not an accident waiting to happen. It was a decision waiting to be made, and it had already been made. Understanding that decision means understanding the world Ford was operating in. The year is 1968. The American auto market is being invaded. Volkswagen's Beetle is selling in numbers Detroit finds genuinely embarrassing. Toyota and Datsun are moving units. Small, cheap, fuel-efficient foreign cars are eating the bottom of the market. The entry-level buyer, the young buyer, the buyer who cannot afford a Mustang and does not want a station wagon. Ford's president, Iacocca, sees the threat clearly. His response is the Pinto, and his mandate is precise to the point of being a slogan: 2,000 pounds, $2,000. The car will weigh no more than 2,000 pounds. It will cost no more than $2,000. It will be on the market by 1971. That last part is where the trouble begins. A typical Ford development cycle ran roughly 43 months from concept to production. Iacocca's schedule gave his engineers approximately 25. 18 months were stripped from the process. Tooling, the expensive fixed infrastructure of the assembly line, was locked in before crash testing was complete. That is not a minor detail. It means that by the time engineers discovered what the Pinto's fuel tank did in a rear-end collision, the cost of changing it had already multiplied enormously. The dias were cut. The schedule was law. The car had been designed around its constraints, not around its occupants. The fuel tank sat behind the rear axle and ahead of the rear bumper. There were, by various measurements, between 9 and 10 inches of crush space between the tank and the point of impact. On the differential housing directly ahead of the tank, there were protruding bolts. In a rear-end impact, as the tank was driven forward, those bolts acted as puncture devices. They tore through the tank wall. Fuel poured out. Filler pipes could separate entirely. And because the Pinto's doors tended to jam in the distorted frame after a collision, occupants could find themselves sealed inside a burning car. Ford's own crash tests confirmed all of this before the Pinto went on sale. Internal reports documented fuel tank ruptures in rear impacts at speeds as low as around 21 miles per hour. 21 miles per hour is not a highway collision. It is a parking lot. It is a slow-moving street. It is the kind of impact that should leave people shaken and annoyed, not burned. The engineers knew. One of them, a senior Ford engineer named Harley Kopp, would later testify against the company, describing from the inside a culture in which the decision to proceed was not made in ignorance. It was made in full awareness of what the test data showed. The question was never whether the tank was dangerous. The question was whether fixing it was worth the cost. A fix existed. It was not complicated. A rubber bladder lining the tank, or a baffle and improved placement, would have significantly reduced the rupture risk. Ford's own engineers had identified the solution. The cost? Approximately $11 per vehicle. $11. That's $11 against a life. Ford did not make the fix. Instead, someone wrote a memo. The document is formally titled Fatalities Associated with Crash-Induced Fuel Leakage and Fires. It is known as the Grush-Saunby analysis, after the Ford analysts whose work underpinned it. It is a cost-benefit analysis, though not strictly a Pinto document. Ford submitted it to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration as an argument against a proposed fuel system safety standard affecting every American car and light truck. And the deaths it modeled were fuel-fed fires across the entire national fleet, not the Pinto alone. The popular retelling has often blurred that line. But the logic the memo reveals is the same logic that governed the Pinto: methodical, formatted, the kind of document that looks, at first glance, like responsible corporate planning. And in a narrow technical sense, it is exactly that, which is precisely what makes it so disturbing. The memo assigns a dollar value to a human death, approximately $200,000 per fatality, drawn from National Highway Traffic Safety Administration guidelines of the era. It assigns values to serious burn injuries and to vehicle damage. It then calculates two numbers: the cost of the deaths, injuries, and burned vehicles the analysis projects across the fleet, and the cost of the proposed fix, multiplied across every car affected. By the memo's own accounting, the deaths came to an estimated $49.5 million in projected liability. The fix came to an estimated $137 million. The memo concludes, the fix is not worth it. The deaths are cheaper. This is not a document written by monsters. That is the detail that should disturb you most. It was written by professionals using an accepted regulatory framework, applying standard actuarial logic. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had itself published the $200,000 figure, but something had gone wrong in the application. The memo was not written to make cars safer. It was written to justify not making them safer. And inside Ford, the same arithmetic governed the Pinto's tank. The math was assembled in the service of a conclusion that had already been reached. The schedule would hold, the price ceiling would hold, and the tank would ship as designed. The car went to market. The documents stayed internal. And people burned. Lilly Gray died. Richard Grimshaw, 13 years old, survived surgeries that lasted years. He lost fingers. He lost his face as it had been. The California jury in Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company awarded him punitive damages of $125 million, a figure that signaled something beyond compensation. It signaled moral condemnation. The judge later reduced it to $3.5 million. Ford appealed. The appeals court upheld the verdict in 1981 and confirmed what the evidence had shown. Ford had known, and Ford had chosen. In 1978, in Elkhart, Indiana, a Ford Pinto carrying 3 teenage girls, Judy, Lynn, and Donna Ulrich, was struck from behind on a highway. The tank ruptured. All 3 girls died. Indiana prosecuted Ford Motor Company for reckless homicide. For the first time in American legal history, a corporation faced criminal charges for the deaths caused by one of its products. Ford was acquitted. No executive went to prison. No individual was charged. The corporation paid fines. It settled civil suits. It absorbed the costs of litigation and recall and reputational damage, and it survived, restructured, and continued. The public exposure had come a year before the Ulrich deaths. In 1977, investigative journalist Mark Dowie published Pinto Madness in Mother Jones magazine. He had obtained the internal documents. He laid out the crash test data, the $11 fix, the cost-benefit memo, and the death toll in plain language. The piece forced a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration investigation. And in 1978, Ford recalled approximately 1.5 million Pintos. The recall came 7 years after the car went on sale. 7 years. Estimates of the deaths linked to Pinto fires vary considerably. Ford's own accounting ran far lower than the figures cited by investigators, and the scholar Gary Schwartz later argued in the Rutgers Law Review that the toll had been overstated in the popular narrative. But Even the most conservative figures describe dozens of deaths in fires that a cheap available fix could have prevented. The higher investigative estimates reach as many as 500 to 900. The precise number, in one sense, is beside the point. The point is that Ford knew. The point is that an $11 solution existed. The point is that someone wrote the math down. If this story has stayed with you, if the cold arithmetic of it feels like something you need to understand more completely, subscribe to Point of Failure. We release new videos every week. Ford was not convicted. Lee Iacocca went on to become chief executive of Chrysler, where he was celebrated as a turnaround genius. The Pinto was discontinued in 1980. The cost-benefit framework that produced the memo was never outlawed. It is still in use. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a description of the present. Every major manufacturer, every pharmaceutical company, every aviation authority, every industrial operation of sufficient scale runs some version of this calculation. The question of whether a safety modification costs more than the projected liability of the deaths it would prevent is a live question in engineering and legal departments right now, today, in buildings not unlike the ones where the Grush-Saunby memo was drafted. Sometimes the calculation produces the right answer. Sometimes the fix gets made because the math says it should, but sometimes it does not. And the only thing standing between that memo and the people it affects is a journalist with a source, a plaintiff's attorney with a subpoena, or an engineer who decides that what they know is too important to stay quiet. Harley Kopp testified. Mark Dowie published. The documents came out. But Lilly Gray was already dead. The Ulrich sisters were already dead. Richard Grimshaw had already burned. The memo had already been written, approved, filed, and acted upon, calmly and professionally, by people who drove home that evening, had dinner, and did not think of themselves as the kind of people who put a price on a human life. They had simply done the math.